Before we talk about how banks create money, we must first examine how banks get their money and what banks do with this money. Where do the banks get their money? There are two main groups that provide money to the banks. Number one is household, and number two are foreigners. Let's look at one specific family, the Millers. Todd is a successful teacher at Radnor, and Tammy is a preschool teacher. Doesn't Tammy look beautiful? Upon receiving Todd's paycheck, Tammy decides she needs another purse. I guess the other 100 in her closet aren't good enough. It is a good thing that Coach is always developing new purses. Woohoo! After purchasing a new purse, Tammy decides she needs a new outfit to complement her purse. So she goes to the store to buy a dress and some shoes. After paying the bills, Tammy puts what is left, if any, in their savings account to help pay for the children's college. It is from Tammy's and the many other savings accounts that the bank uses to make loans. The two main groups that borrow money are the government and firms. Government needs money to pay their bills, and firms need money to invest in the production of more and better products. Now that we understand where a bank gets its money and what a bank does with its money, we can begin to answer the question of how banks create more money. One day, a man named John enters the Bank of Miller with $100 cash. John, a graduate from Radnor High School, made a safe bet on the Radnor LM game. Go Raiders! And John wants to make sure his money is safe. John is worried if he doesn't deposit the money into the bank, his wife might find the cash and buy a new purse. John's wife and Todd's wife are good friends. Before we see how the Bank of Miller will create new money from John's deposit, we need to review some need-to-know terms. The first term is a reserve requirement. This is a fraction of a deposit that a bank is required to hold. The Federal Reserve determines the percent that the bank must hold. For example, if the Federal Reserve is 20%, the bank must hold 20% of John's deposit. That means that the bank must hold $20. Anything above the required reserve is considered excess reserves. It is from the excess reserves that the bank will generate loans that will increase the money supply. Since the bank was required to hold $20 of John's money, the excess reserves would be $80. The bank can hold the reserves in their own vault or at the Fed. Both are easily accessible. Time to think. What happened to the overall money supply when John deposited the $100 in the Bank of Miller? Nothing happened to the money supply. This is because it doesn't matter if the money is under John's bed, in Tammy's purse, or in a bank, it's still considered the money supply. The money supply includes cash, coins, checks, saving, mutual funds, and any other type of liquid instrument held by the bank. Before returning to John's deposit, you need to understand how the U.S. measures the money supply. The narrowest definition of the money supply is M1. M1 is defined as all forms of money that is easily accessible. Two examples of M1 are checks and cash. The bank does not have to be open for you to use cash or write a check. In 2012, M1 equaled $2 trillion, $1 trillion in cash and $1 trillion in checks. M2 is a much broader measure of money. M2 includes M1, savings, mutual funds, and small time deposits. For the longest time, M1 was the most important measure of money because it was much easier to get to than M2. With the invention of the ATM, depositors can now make withdrawals anytime. Since all methods are now readily available, M2 is a more popular measure. In 2012, M2 equaled $10 trillion. $6 trillion of this was in savings. The third and final supply of money is M3. M3 equals M1 plus M2 plus any time deposits over $100,000. Let's return to our example of John depositing $100 in the bank. Money is creating in the banking system by a cycle of loans and deposits, ending when there are no more excess reserves. In our example, John deposits $100. His bank is required to keep 20%, which is $20. That means the bank has $80 in excess reserves. It is with the excess reserves that the bank will create a loan. Once a loan is created, there is new money in the system. Let me say that again. Once a loan is created, there is new money in the system. Before John deposited that money, and before the bank created a loan, the money supply was 100. But when the Bank of Miller created that $80 loan, the money supply increased by $80. In order to understand just how much money is going to be created by John's deposit, let's take a look at some more examples. Jane borrows that money for $80. Jane deposits that into her bank. Her bank then keeps the required reserve of 20%, which is $16, and has $64 in excess reserve. Jane's bank decides they want to loan that $64 out, so they loan it to a woman named Trish. Trish takes the $64 to her bank. Her bank takes out the 20%, which is $13.80, and has $51.20. Trish's bank loans that out to Wanda. Wanda now has a loan of $51.20. So if we stop the process right here, we can see the money supply has increased by $195.20. We know this because $80 was given to Jane, $64 was given to Trish, and $51.20 was given to Wanda. All this $195.20 came from John's initial deposit of $100. So when will this process stop? When will John's money stop multiplying? Before answering this question, you need to know the term the money multiplier. The money multiplier is the rate at which banks create money. Now, in order for the multiplier to work, two things has to happen. Number one, all the currency must be deposited in a bank. Number two, the bank has to lend out all of its excess reserves. Let's take a closer look at the multiplier. The multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So let's pretend that the reserve requirement in John's bank was 5%. 1 divided by 0.05 equals 20. So what that means is when the bank makes that first loan of $80, that $80 will multiply 20 times. So John's $100 will create an excess of $1,600. If the reserve requirement was 10%, 1 divided by 0.10 is 10, which means that first loan of $80 would only create $800 as opposed to $1,600. If the reserve requirement was 15%, 1 divided by 0.15 equals a multiplier of 6.6. If the loan was $80, that would multiply 6.6 times, and that would equal $528. If the reserve requirement was 20%, the multiplier would be 5. 1 divided by 0.20 equals 5, which means that loan of $80 will be multiplied 5 times and will equal $400. So what can we learn from this example? The lower the reserve requirement, the higher the multiplier, and the more money that's going to be created. There is more money created at 5% required reserve than at 20% required reserve. So the higher the reserve requirement, the lower the multiplier, and the less amount of money that can be created. So, how do banks create money? Banks create money by loaning. more loans equals more money. We talked about how the bank takes John's deposit and turns that into loans. There is another way that banks get money, and this is by the buying and selling of bonds. We will talk about the role of the Fed in another video, but I think it's important to mention in this video that the Fed can give banks more money, and if the Fed gives banks more money, they're going to make more loans. So how does the Fed give banks more money? They buy bonds. So I want you to think this way. I want you to think about a bank that has a bond. This bond is worth $100,000, but the bank can't turn that into a loan because it's not cash. So let's say the Fed buys that bond. So the Fed takes that bond from the bank and gives the bank money. Now that the bank has money, the bank can make more loans. So buy bonds, big bucks. When the Fed buys bonds, it puts more money into the bank's reserves and the bank can make more loans. If the Federal Reserve wants to take money out of the system, the Federal Reserve will sell the bond. The bank gives money to the Fed and the Fed gives the bank a bond. Now, because the bank doesn't have as much money, they can't make as many loans. One last thing about the buying and selling of bonds. When the Fed buys bond, they are putting new money in the economy. So if the Fed buys a bond for $100,000, the economy's money has just increased by $100,000. If the Federal Reserve sells a bond for $100,000, now the Fed pulls $100,000 out of the economy. So when the Fed buys a bond, that's brand new money in the economy. When the Fed sells a bond, they're taking money out of the economy. Time to think. What is the impact to the money supply if John deposits $100 versus if the Fed buys $100 in bonds? To answer this question, let's go back to our example of John depositing money into the bank. John deposits $100. Remember, the bank has to keep $20 of that in reserves, required reserves. So that means the bank can only loan out $80. We know the multiplier, 1 divided by 0.20 is 5, which means from that $80 of loans, that will generate $400 new dollars. When the Fed buys a bond for $100, that $100 is brand new money into the economy. So when the bank loans out that $100, it's 100 times the multiplier, which is 5, which means the money supply increases by 500. The difference of the $100 between John and the Fed is that John's $100 was in the money supply before he put it in the bank. The Fed, when they bought that bond, that was 100 new dollars in the economy. And that's why when the Fed buys a bond, it's going to be more expansive to the money supply than if someone deposits their money into the bank. So, in conclusion, how do banks create money? Banks create money by creating loans. Loans from people's deposits and loans from the Fed buying bonds. Remember, when the Fed buys a bond, that's going to create more money than when John makes a deposit in a bank.